Sukuna is one of the most iconic villains in recent anime history, and his powers are equally legendary. Its most recognizable forms are Cleave and Dismantle, which inflict cuts so deep it can permanently wound a person's existence, or even simply delete them from reality. This kind of overpowered evilness only works because its user is nerfed from the very beginning of the story. Sukuna remains trapped inside Yuji, so we don't see his true potential until much later. However, let's imagine a reality where Yuji ends up being born with Sukuna's technique, and we get to see his power level increase with age. How overpowered would he become? Would he pass Sukuna? Most importantly, would Yuji let the darkness corrupt him and walk the same path as Sukuna? Or would he choose to use his powers for good? Let's do a deep dive into this theoretical world. Since birth, Yuji's childhood consisted of strange incidents happening every other day. Adults called him gifted because strange things around him always had ordinary explanations. Plastic toys cracked along perfectly straight lines after he squeezed them too hard. Building blocks separated into neat halves instead of shattering. During baseball, balls sometimes lost air after impact, and coaches joked that he threw too hard. Yuji accepted every explanation because children assume their normal is everyone's normal. The first time he began suspecting something might be wrong was right after an anger outburst. Yuji saw a classmate getting bullied and felt a wave of anger wash over him. He gripped a nearby metal railing hard, only to realize that the metal had been cleanly sliced off. For weeks, he avoided touching things when emotional. He never told anyone. Eventually, he convinced himself that he had imagined it. As Yuji entered middle school, he finally connected the dots and realized that things started exploding every time he lost control of his emotions. Once during baseball practice, he hit a fastball and watched it continue forward for a second before splitting into uneven pieces midair. Yuji started testing out this strange phenomenon in secret. He stared at a stack of papers, imagining his teachers yelling at him. A thin line appeared on the edges of the stack, making Yuji back away in fear. So he made strict rules for himself. He must never get angry or grab people while being emotional. Without understanding cursed energy, Yuji accidentally built training habits around suppression. By the time Yuji met Megumi and learned about curses and cursed energy, he had already spent years quietly believing there was something wrong with him. When the finger appeared and swallowing it became the only way to save everyone, Yuji acted without hesitation. He expected to feel pain, or some overwhelming surge of power, but instead, he felt something unlock inside him, and he finally began to understand the strange power within him. Then, Sukuna appeared. He stared at Yuji for a long time, recognizing that he possessed the same curse technique as himself. He asked Yuji a million questions, like how long has he had this power, who taught him this, and when did he first start cutting up things. But Yuji remained clueless, since he was born with this curse and had spent his entire life hiding it. During the detention center arc, Yuji realized the true strength of his powers for the first time. Yuji still fought like usual, jumping headfirst and throwing punches left and right, but this time around, his movements were charged with a special curse, causing his enemies to split apart upon contact. Arms sliced off before contact fully landed, flesh opened in clean patterns. Meanwhile, Sukuna simply watched in silence, passing sarcastic remarks and judging Yuji's poor control over his powers. Although Yuji felt annoyed by his comments, he couldn't deny that they were helpful. Megumi noticed this change as well. Yuji was adapting too quickly, staying too calm, and worst of all, he sometimes looked like he already knew where to cut before the fight even started. During Yuji's training, Gojo realized that he was absorbing cursed energy concepts at an alarmingly quick rate. But Yuji's method of learning was quite bizarre. He kept arriving at effective answers without learning the steps in between. Gojo started changing the training deliberately, forcing Yuji to practice more control, fight defensively, and try to survive without attacking. Yuji followed instructions, but privately he disliked it, because fighting had become simple now. Nobara was a fan of Yuji's all-in approach. She only cared about the end results, which were always in their favor when Yuji was fighting. Meanwhile, Megumi supported Gojo's approach a lot more, because he noticed that after fights, Yuji looked strangely satisfied. During Yuji's first encounter with Mahito, it becomes clear to him that his strategy of overwhelming enemies with his crazy ability isn't viable. Yuji cut him more than once and watched the wound close. He cut deeper and saw the body reshape. He attacked faster and nothing changed. For the first time, his technique looked ordinary. Out of desperation, Yuji sought help from Sukuna, who advised him to cut deeper, instead of cutting faster. The Kyoto Goodwill event changed how everyone looked at Yuji. He swept through his opponents with absolute ease, defeating them all and rising to the top with frightening efficiency. The fights looked controlled until people realized Yuji was ending battles before they properly began. Toto became interested immediately, but his training strategy changed completely, focusing on building restraint and controlling his urge to dive into the heart of battle directly. The death painting fight disturbed Yuji in a way previous battles never had, because for the first time, he noticed his technique behaving differently depending on what he was cutting. Against living targets, his cuts appeared faster and without much resistance, almost as if his ability was made to target real living flesh. His attacks needed less energy and produced cleaner results. The fight with the brothers ended almost as quickly as it started, with frightening efficiency. Yuji should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt sick. There was no excitement afterward, no sense of struggle, just the realization that hurting people was becoming easier. Meanwhile, Sukuna was delighted with his improvement, and let Yuji know that he was doing good. Yuji hated how good this validation felt, because Sukuna was the last person he wanted to impress. The hidden inventory arc changed the way Gojo looked at Yuji. Seeing his own past again and remembering what limitless power had done to his relationships made him notice something uncomfortable within Yuji. Yuji was becoming isolated because of how good a fighter he had become. People were starting to distance themselves from him, because Yuji was also way too absorbed in his own world to care about others. Gojo changed his strategy going forward, trying to build a good relationship with Yuji alongside the training. He checked up on him regularly, trying to have conversations outside of training. Sukuna notices this immediately, saying that Gojo is trying to save Yuji before he's too far gone. Meanwhile, Yuji can't decide if he should accept Gojo's helping hand or continue moving on the path to greatness. The Shibuya incident was the moment Yuji stopped fearing Sukuna and started understanding him. When Yuji finally lost control, Sukuna took over like expected, but instead of locking Yuji away and turning the city into a massacre, he left him awake inside his own body and made him watch everything. Sukuna fought using the same technique Yuji had been developing all this time, except every movement looked effortless. Yuji slowly realized that this entire time, the fighting style he was developing had not been his at all. It was a primitive version of Sukuna's, and every time Yuji accepted his advice, he became closer to reaching Sukuna's standards. From this point onwards, Yuji struggled with an identity crisis, because Sukuna's voice was in his head all the time, and now even his fighting was becoming similar to his. He wondered how long it would take until he and Sukuna became one and the same. In order to separate himself from Sukuna, Yuji began experimenting heavily with his powers, to have proof that the technique itself was not the problem. He cut the ground to redirect movement, and even split incoming attacks without harming opponents. He was indirectly applying the lessons he had been taught by Gojo and his friends, while rebelling against the lessons that Sukuna had drilled into his brain. Sukuna hated this change, saying that it's a waste of time and effort, and that Yuji should go all in to reach absolute power. In this alternate timeline, when the order is passed to exterminate Yuji, the people were not really afraid of Sukuna trapped inside his mind. They were afraid of what would happen if Yuji was allowed to live and master his abilities. Yuta accepted the mission fully knowing that Yuji would be a challenging opponent to beat. However, during the fight, Yuta saw Yuji making reckless decisions, missing obvious openings, and exerting himself way too much. He realized that Yuji was actually trying his best to resist Sukuna's influence over him, which made him a worse fighter. The culling game became the first time Yuji stopped comparing himself to Sukuna. Up till now, all his actions were either about seeking Sukuna's approval or going completely against his advice to distance himself from him. However, facing the unpredictable fighters and impossible conditions of the culling game made Yuji naturally use his own mind to solve problems rather than relying on Sukuna's guidance. For the first time, he felt his own identity had a moment to shine. When Sukuna finally leaves Yuji, he expects to feel totally empty inside. For months, he had convinced himself that no matter how much he trained or changed, part of his strength still came from having Sukuna lend it. But no matter how much time passed, Yuji's powers remained exactly the same. His cuts still retained their precision and sharpness. Yuji realized that he still retained all his skills because they had always belonged to him since his birth. Sukuna had only helped him develop his power and sharpen up his cuts, but the innate curse technique had been his since the very beginning. During the final showdown between Yuji and Sukuna, the spectators described it as an endless onslaught of attacks that never landed, because both fighters used the same offensive and defensive strategies. Neither of them were holding back, yet neither seemed to be in the advantage. The conclusion of their battle can go two ways. In one timeline, Yuji resists Sukuna's corruption and recalls the lessons he's been taught by Gojo and his friends. Their guidance gives him the edge that helps him defeat Sukuna, proving that great power does not have to come with pure evil. On the other hand, in the second timeline, Yuji grows tired of the endless battles, and in a moment of weakness, fully gives in to Sukuna's corruption. Years and years of fighting against his own true nature became exhausting, until Yuji realized that maybe Sukuna was right all along. The sorcerer world is in great danger now, since they have to deal with both Sukuna and Yuji, who would prove to be difficult for even someone like Gojo. If you want to see similar videos with many more crazy theories, make sure to click on the link that's appearing on your screen. Go ahead, click it!